The temperature was 20 below zero, and I couldn't feel my hands anymore. 30 of us, Hell's Angels, patches and all, were about to die on the side of a Montana highway, and there was nothing we could do about it. Then Danny walked up to that porch and knocked on the door, and a 78-year-old woman opened it. She looked at us. 30 of the most feared bikers in the Northwest, frost on our jackets, ice in our beards, and she didn't reach for a phone. She didn't slam the door. She didn't call out for help. She said, "You boys look half frozen. You better come inside." What happened in that farmhouse over the next 14 hours changed every single one of us forever. And nobody and not one person saw it coming. I've been carrying this story in my chest for over 30 years now. Not in the way a man carries regret. Lord knows I've got plenty of that too. But in the way you carry something precious. Something so unlikely, so raw and real, that you almost don't believe it happened even when you were right there in the middle of it. I'm 72 years old. My knees ache on cold mornings. My hands look like old leather that's been left out in the sun too long, cracked and worn at every knuckle. I've got scars on my forearms that each tell a story, and some of those stories I'll take to the grave. But this one deserves to be told. My name is Michael Rourke. I've been a member of the Hell's Angels for 46 years. I'm not going to stand here and pretend we were choir boys. We weren't. We lived hard, we rode hard, and we made decisions that didn't always sit well with the law or with decent society. I understand why people crossed the street when they saw us coming. I understand why mothers pulled their kids closer when we rolled into a gas station 30 men deep, our engine shaking the windows, our leather cuts drawing stares from every direction. I get it, I really do. But there's a difference between what people think they see and what's actually standing in front of them. And the woman who taught me that lesson, who taught all of us that lesson, was 78 years old, stood about 5'2", and smelled like cinnamon and pine sap. Her name was Eleanor Grace Whitfield, and she lived in a white farmhouse just off Route 2 outside of Havre, Montana. And on the second Saturday of February, 1991, she looked out her kitchen window, saw 30 of the most feared bikers in the Pacific Northwest, half dead in her front yard, and didn't call the police. She put on a pot of soup. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started. Let me take you back to the road. February in Montana isn't winter the way most Americans understand winter. It's not the romantic kind, with snowflakes drifting past streetlights and kids building snowmen in the yard. Montana winter is a different beast entirely. It's a living thing, mean and indifferent, with a wind that comes screaming down from Canada like it has a personal grudge against anything warm. The sky turns the color of a dirty nickel, flat and heavy and low, and the temperature can drop 20 degrees in an hour without the slightest warning. Old-timers up there will tell you that Montana doesn't get cold, it gets lethal, and they're not exaggerating. I was 40 years old that February. I wasn't road captain yet. That was Danny Hargrove's job. And Danny wore that title like a second skin. Big man, Danny, 6'4", built like a refrigerator that had been left outside too long and grown a beard. He had a laugh you could hear from 2 blocks away, and a temper that could fill a room in about 3 seconds flat. But he knew how to lead a run. He'd been doing it since before some of the younger guys had learned to shave. When Danny said we were riding to the rally in Billings, you didn't ask questions. You checked your bike, you checked your gear, and you showed up ready to roll at whatever time Danny said. There were 30 of us that Saturday morning when we pulled out of Missoula. 30 bikes, 30 men, a column of iron and leather and noise that stretched back half a city block. I remember the sound of it, that deep rolling thunder of 30 engines turning over in unison, the exhaust clouds rising in the frozen air like smoke signals, the smell of oil and fuel that had been part of my life for so long, it might as well have been perfume. I remember feeling that particular kind of alive that you only feel when you own a bike with your brothers beside you, and the road opening up ahead. It doesn't matter how old you get, that feeling never changes. It's the purest thing I've ever known. The weather report that morning had been cautious but not alarming. A system moving in from the northwest, possible snow in the late afternoon. We'd ridden in worse. Danny checked the forecast, checked it again, and made the call. We'd push through to Billings, get ahead of the system, and be inside with cold beers in our hands before the first flake hit the ground. That was the plan. Plans and Montana weather have a complicated relationship. We made it about 140 miles before the sky turned on us. I was riding near the middle of the column, just behind Pete Calloway, our mechanic. Pete was one of those guys who could fix anything with his hands. Engines, transmissions, relationships. He had a way of looking at a broken thing and understanding it that most people couldn't explain. I always liked riding behind Pete. He had a smooth, steady way on the road that was calming, predictable, which is why I noticed immediately when his bike started drifting. The wind hit us first, not a gust, a wall. I felt my front wheel push sideways like someone had grabbed the handlebars and yanked, and I corrected hard, leaning into it, feeling the tires bite and hold. Around me I heard the formation react, engines revving, the column compressing as guys slowed and steadied. Then the snow came, not flurries, not even heavy snowfall. This was what they call a whiteout, a solid curtain of white that dropped from the sky like someone had pulled a sheet over the world. Within 60 seconds, I couldn't see Pete's taillight. Within 2 minutes, I couldn't see the road markings. Within 5 minutes, Route 2 had become a gray-white blur that looked exactly like the ditch on either side of it, and the temperature had dropped so fast I could feel it through my jacket, through my thermal layer, through my flannel shirt, straight down to my skin. I've been cold before, cold enough that your fingers stop working, cold enough that your face goes numb and you bite your lip and don't feel it. But this was something else. This was the kind of cold that doesn't just affect your body. It starts working on your mind. It makes you slow. It makes you stupid. It makes perfectly experienced riders start doing things they'd never do in ordinary conditions, like following the man in front of them too closely or braking too hard on a surface that's turned to black ice under half an inch of fresh powder. Danny pulled us over. There was no discussion, no vote. That was never how it worked. He got on the radio, his voice calm and clipped, the way it always was when things got serious. And he said 2 words, "We stop." And we stopped. We were on a stretch of Route 2 about 12 miles east of Havre, as far as any of us could figure. The GPS units most of us carried were consumer-grade things, not built for whiteout conditions. And half of them had frozen over by the time we got the bikes to the shoulder. We were in open country, flat, treeless, nothing but snow and wind in every direction. The nearest town was Havre, but 12 miles on foot in those conditions wasn't a walk. It was a death march. We huddled. 30 men standing in a blizzard on the shoulder of a Montana highway. Engines off now because the fuel situation was getting uncertain, and nobody wanted to burn what little we had left on idle heat. The wind was brutal. I remember pulling my bandana up over my face and feeling it freeze against my skin within minutes. I remember looking at the men around me, men I'd ridden with for years, men I'd have trusted with my life in any situation, and seeing something I'd rarely seen on those faces. Fear. Not panic. Hell's Angels don't panic. But fear. That quiet, honest acknowledgement that the situation is beyond your control and you are genuinely in danger. That was there. In the set of Danny's jaw. In the way Pete kept flexing his hands inside his gloves, trying to keep the circulation going. In the way Stitch Beaumont, 28 years old, newest member of our chapter, tough as anyone I'd ever met, kept looking down the road toward Havre, like he was trying to will it closer by force of will alone. Stitch was something of a study in contradictions. He'd come to us from Butte, had a reputation that arrived 3 weeks before he did, and in his first month he'd managed to both impress Danny Hargrove and nearly get thrown out of the chapter twice. He was all sharp edges and bad attitude on the surface. The kind of young man who wore his toughness like armor because it was the only armor he'd ever had. He didn't like asking for help. I'm not sure he knew how. But standing there in that blizzard, even Stitch wasn't too proud to look worried. "We need shelter," Danny said. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Options. There weren't many. The map, an actual paper map that Danny kept in his saddlebag because he never fully trusted electronics, showed a farmhouse about 1.5 miles off Route 2, down a county road that we could barely make out through the snow. It was the only structure within reasonable distance. Danny looked at the map, looked at the sky, looked at his men, and made the call the same way he always made calls. "We ride for it," he said, "slow and together. Nobody drops back, nobody rushes. We move like one unit or we don't move at all." We moved. That 1.5 miles was the longest ride of my life. I've ridden in rain so heavy it felt like a wall of water. I've ridden through desert heat that warped the air above the asphalt. I've ridden through mountain passes where one wrong move would have put me off a cliff edge. But that 1.5 miles through the Montana blizzard, on an ice county road I could barely see, with the temperature somewhere around 0 and dropping, with 30 men around me all fighting the same conditions, that was different. That was the kind of riding that strips everything away. All the attitude, all the image, all the swagger that comes with the patch and the cut and the name. All of it gone. Just men on machines trying to stay alive and stay together. We came over a small rise and through a gap in the white, I saw it. A light. Just one light, yellow and warm in a front window, like a single candle in the middle of the world's largest dark room. A white farmhouse, 2 stories, with a covered porch and a bare oak tree in the front yard that had been there long enough to be as wide around as a man's reach. A red barn behind it and a split rail fence that disappeared into the snow on both sides. Danny pulled up to the gate. We all stopped behind him. 30 bikes in a field of white, engines ticking in the cold. He looked at the house for a moment, then he looked back at us. "I'll go knock," he said. Nobody argued. I watched him walk up the porch steps, his boots crunching on the frozen wood. I watched him knock on the door. 3 solid knocks, the kind of knock that says this is serious, without being aggressive. I watched the yellow light in the window shift as someone moved behind it. Then the porch light came on, and the door opened, ready for anything. Shotgun, slamming door, screaming. He'd mentally prepared for all of it on the walk up those porch steps. What he had not prepared for was that. What he had not prepared for was a small, white-haired woman in a blue cardigan and wool slippers, looking at him the same way she'd look at a neighbor who'd come over to borrow a cup of sugar. He stood there for a second, this big man who was afraid of nothing, and he said, "Ma'am, there are 30 of us." And she said, "I can count. Come inside before you catch your death." There was a moment I was watching from the gate. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the body language. Where Danny just stood there on that porch, just stood there, this force of nature of a man, standing still in the middle of a blizzard. And then he turned around and looked at us. And even from 100 feet away in a snowstorm, I could see his expression. And his expression said, "I don't know what this is, but I think it might be the most unusual thing that's ever happened to me." He waved us up. We moved slowly, carefully, unsure of ourselves in a way that would have been embarrassing under any other circumstances. 30 Hell's Angels, shuffling up the path toward a farmhouse porch like schoolboys being let in from the rain. I remember the feeling of it, that strange awkwardness, that conscious awareness of our own size and our own presence, and what we must have looked like against the backdrop of this quiet white farmhouse. We were trying not to track too much snow. We were trying not to knock things over. We were trying, in that fumbling way that large and rough men try when suddenly placed in delicate circumstances, to be careful. The house was warm. That's the first thing I registered when I stepped through that door. Just the heat of it hitting my face and hands like something physical, like stepping into a different world. A wood stove in the corner of the living room was working hard, glowing orange through the grate. And the smell, God, the smell, pine from the fire, something cooking on the stove in the kitchen, coffee, and underneath it all, that particular smell of an old house that's been lived in and loved for decades. A smell made up of furniture polish and old books and the accumulated warmth of years of ordinary life. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing it in. Around me, the other men were filing in, filling the living room and the hallway, and pressing into the kitchen doorway. 30 big men in a house that was probably built for a family of 5. We were too many. We were too loud, even when we were being quiet. We were too present. But Eleanor Grace Whitfield moved through us without a moment's hesitation, touching shoulders to redirect people, pointing men toward the kitchen, talking in that calm, steady voice like she'd been expecting us. "Living room, as many as will fit," she said. "The rest of you in the kitchen, there's floor space. Jackets off and hang them on the hooks by the door. There's no room otherwise. Don't worry about the floor. I've got rugs." She disappeared into the kitchen. We looked at each other. Pete Calloway was the first one to actually move. He unzipped his jacket, hung it on one of the hooks by the door, and there was a whole row of them, because this was a working farmhouse, and working farmhouses always have coat hooks. And he turned to the rest of us with this expression that was equal parts disbelief and something approaching wonder. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. We got out of our jackets. We found floor space. We sat, some on the couch, some on the floor, some leaning against the walls. Stitch Beaumont ended up sitting on the bottom step of the staircase with his back against the banister, his long legs stretched out in front of him, and he was looking around the room with those sharp eyes of his, with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something open, something unguarded. Danny had followed Eleanor into the kitchen, and I could hear them talking, his low rumble and her calm, practical voice, though I couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes he came back out, and he stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and he addressed us the way he always addressed us, straight and simple. Her name is Eleanor Whitfield, he said. She lives alone. She's got soup on the stove. She's making more. She's got coffee. She wants us to stay until the storm passes. He paused. I told her we'd be careful with her house. I'm telling you the same thing. We treat this place and this woman with respect. Every single one of you. Are we clear? 30 voices answered in various ways, but the message was the same. We were clear. Eleanor came out of the kitchen about 20 minutes later with a tray, an actual tray with a lace cloth on it, the kind of thing you see in a grandmother's house and nowhere else, carrying mugs of coffee and a small pitcher of cream and a bowl of sugar. She moved through the room, stepping over legs, navigating around big men, like water finding its way through rocks, offering coffee with a matter-of-factness that made it feel like this was simply what you did when people came to your door in a blizzard. I was sitting on the floor near the window, my back against the wall, and when she got to me, she looked at me directly, really looked at me, the way some old people do, without the sideways glance and the polite avoidance that most people use when they're uncomfortable. And she said, "Cream and sugar?" "Just black, thank you, ma'am," I said. She handed me a mug. Her hands were small and slightly arthritic, the knuckles swollen, but steady as the earth. "You've got road rash on that cheek," she said, nodding toward a scrape I'd gotten 2 weeks earlier. "In a different story entirely. I've got calendula salve in the bathroom cabinet if you want it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said thank you. She moved on. I held that warm mug in both hands, and I felt something shifting in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Something uncomfortable, something that required examination. The soup came out in batches, big pots of beef vegetable that she'd apparently had on all day, thick and dark and rich, ladled into every bowl and mug and container she owned, because there weren't enough dishes for 30 men. She handed out crackers and a loaf of bread she'd baked that morning, and she apologized that she didn't have enough butter for everyone. And the way she said it, with genuine regret, like she'd let us down, was so profoundly different from anything I'd expected in that moment that I had to look away. It was during that soup, that long, strange, warm hour of 30 Hell's Angels, sitting in a farmhouse in a Montana blizzard and eating an old woman's soup, that something began to change. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just quietly, the way temperatures rise in a room when enough people are in it. The men began to relax. Conversation started, not with each other only, with her. She moved around the room asking questions, and they were the kinds of questions that people never asked us. Not about the club, not about what we did, not about our reputation or our record. She asked where we were from. She asked what we did for work. Most of us had jobs, legitimate work, that people outside never thought to ask about. She asked about our families. When she got to Stitch Beaumont, still on that bottom step with his long legs and his guarded eyes, she sat down beside him on the step. Just sat right down, this small woman in her wool slippers, and she said, "You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in a few days." Stitch stared at her. His jaw worked. "I'm fine," he said. "That's not what I asked," she said pleasantly, and went back to the kitchen, and came back with a bowl that was noticeably fuller than the rest, and handed it to him. And he took it without a word, and I watched him eat, and I watched his face while he ate, and I saw something happen to it that I don't have exact words for. something breaking open, something releasing, like a hand that had been clenched for too long, finally letting go. He was 28 years old. He'd grown up hard and alone, and had spent his whole life making sure nobody could see that. And this woman had seen it in 60 seconds. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, 30 men who scared the rest of the world were sitting quietly in a farmhouse, eating soup, getting warm, and beginning, without understanding it yet, to understand something about the distance between what we appeared to be and what we actually were. I should tell you about the neighbor. Carl Briggs lived about 2 miles down the county road on a property that shared a fence line with Elner's farm. He was 60 years old, a man who'd spent his life in that valley and knew everybody in it and had opinions about all of them. He was not by any measure I can apply a bad man. He was a community man, a church deacon, a volunteer for the county road crew every winter. But he was also a man who had spent 6 decades having his worldview confirmed by the world around him. And his worldview included very specific ideas about men like us. He'd seen us come in off Route 2. He'd been in his truck fighting the storm himself on his way home, and he'd seen the column of bikes turning down the county road toward Elner's property. And he'd done what a concerned neighbor does. He'd called the county sheriff's office. Then he'd gone home, and he'd sat by his window watching through binoculars, and he'd waited. We didn't know any of this at the time. What we knew about 2 hours into our stay at Elena's was that the storm wasn't letting up. Danny had been on the phone, the landline, because our cell service had died entirely, trying to reach contacts in Hava and getting mostly static and busy signals. The storm had apparently hit the whole region hard, with multiple accidents reported on Route 2, and the state highway crews pulling their plows back off the roads until visibility improved. We were, for the foreseeable future, exactly where we were. Nobody was complaining. That surprised me, honestly. Hell's Angels runs are built on momentum. You're going somewhere, always going somewhere, and stopping is not the default state. Stopping means something went wrong, and something going wrong in our world is rarely an occasion for relaxation. But the combination of the warmth, the food, and the particular atmosphere that Elena had created, calm, unhurried, quietly generous, had done something to the group that I was watching with a kind of fascination. Men were talking, actually talking, conversations I hadn't heard on a run before, about their kids, about their work, about their plans. Pete Calloway was in the kitchen helping Elena wash dishes, which was so unexpected that when I first looked in and saw it, I actually stopped in the doorway and stared for a moment. Pete, who could rebuild a carburetor in his sleep, but had never once, in the 8 years I'd known him, voluntarily done domestic work of any kind, was standing at Eleanor's sink in his flannel shirt with his sleeves rolled up, carefully washing soup bowls and stacking them on the drying rack, while Eleanor dried and put away and talked to him about her late husband, a man named George, who had died 7 years earlier, and who had apparently been, by Eleanor's description, a deeply impractical man with an extraordinary heart. He tried to fix the tractor himself once, she was saying as I stood in the doorway, and there was laughter in her voice that was also something else, something that lives right next to grief in the human chest, and sometimes sounds exactly like it. Spent 3 weekends on it. Cost us 4 times as much to fix what he'd broken as it would have cost to call someone from the start. But he was so pleased with himself. She shook her head, smiling at the plate in her hand. I never told him I called Pete Halverson to come out and quietly redo it. Some things a wife keeps to herself. Pete laughed, a real laugh, deep and warm, and I slipped away from the doorway because that moment felt private in a way that I didn't want to intrude on. I found a corner of the living room and sat down and thought about what I was witnessing. Eleanor had a photograph on the mantel above the wood stove, a large family portrait, the kind that gets taken every decade or so at Thanksgiving or Christmas, with everyone gathered on the porch and the newer generations getting taller every cycle. I counted 17 people in it. In the center of the photograph, clearly the gravitational point of the whole image, was a younger version of Eleanor, maybe 65 in the picture, standing with a man who must have been George, tall and thin and gentle-looking, with his arm around her shoulders and a smile on his face that said everything about what that marriage had been. I looked at her face in that photograph for a long time. Then I looked around the room at my brothers, big rough men who'd spent their lives being seen as a threat, sitting in the warmth and the light of this woman's house, and I thought, what would George Whitfield make of this? What would he think if he could look through that window right now? I had a feeling he'd approve. I had a feeling he'd be right there in the kitchen with Pete, washing dishes and asking questions. Stitch had moved from the stairs. He was sitting on the floor near the wood stove, close enough to feel the heat, and he'd pulled his boots off and set them beside him, and he was just sitting there in his socks, staring at the fire through the grate. I went and sat near him. We didn't talk for a while. Stitch wasn't much for talking unless he had something specific to say. After a few minutes he said, without looking at me, "She's not scared of us." "No," I said. "Why not?" I thought about that. "I think," I said slowly, "because she looks at people and sees what's actually there, not what she's been told is there." Stitch was quiet for another minute. Then he said, "My grandmother was like that." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I understood what he was telling me, and I understood what it cost him to say it, and I let it stand. That's when we heard the knock at the door. Eleanor came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and opened the door, and there was Carl Briggs on the porch, in his heavy coat and his county sheriff's auxiliary hat, snow on his shoulders, with an expression on his face that was working hard to look neutral and not quite succeeding. "Eleanor," he said. He glanced past her into the living room, and I watched his eyes move across us, all of us, the patches, the leather, the size and the number of us, and I watched his expression shift through several things very quickly before settling on something controlled and careful. "I wanted to check on you. Saw some bikes come down the road. Carl," Eleanor's voice was perfectly warm, "come in out of the cold." "I'm fine out here," he said, still looking past her at us. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right, that everything was..." "Everything is fine," Eleanor said. "These men are guests in my house. They were caught in the storm." Carl Briggs looked at her directly then. Something in his face shifted, something uncertain crossing the certainty. "Eleanor, do you know who these..." "I know exactly who they are," she said, and her voice was still warm, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been there all along, but that she'd had no reason to show until this moment. Something like iron. "There are 30 men who needed shelter and food and warmth, and I had shelter and food and warmth to offer, and so I offered it, the same as I would for anyone." Carl Briggs stood on that porch in the snow for a long moment. I could see him processing, recalculating. He was not a stupid man. He could see what he could see. A living room full of bikers who were sitting quietly, who were not drunk or disorderly, who were not causing any visible harm. He could see Eleanor standing in her own doorway, composed and calm and entirely unafraid. He could see that whatever he'd expected to find here, distress, danger, an old woman in need of rescue, was not what was actually in front of him. "I called the sheriff's office," he said. He seemed to say it more to Eleanor than to us, but the information was clearly meant for the room. "Did you?" Eleanor said. "Deputy should be by in a while, when the road's clear enough." "That's fine," Eleanor said. "He's welcome too. Tell him I've got soup." Another long pause. Carl Briggs looked past her one more time, and our eyes met briefly across the room. His uncertain and stubborn and working toward something he didn't quite have yet, and mine trying to be neutral, trying not to give him anything to react to. Then he looked back at Eleanor. "You sure you're all right?" "Carl Briggs," she said. And now there was the warmth and the iron together, a combination that would have been remarkable in a woman half her age. "I have been taking care of myself on this property for 78 years, and I will continue to do so. Thank you for your concern. Now go home before you freeze." He went. She closed the door. She turned back to the room. 30 pairs of eyes were on her. The room was completely silent. She looked around at us, and she said, in exactly the same tone she'd used when she'd first opened the door and told us we'd better come inside, "Who wants more coffee?" The silence broke in laughter, real laughter, warm and involuntary, from men who didn't laugh easily. Even Danny Hargrove, even Danny, who I'd seen smile maybe 6 times in 15 years, was laughing, a deep rumbling sound that shook his whole chest. And Eleanor stood in the middle of it with her dish towel over her shoulder and a slight smile on her face, and if she was pleased with herself, she had every right to be. I looked over at Stitch. He was laughing too, and his face, in that moment of unguarded laughter, looked exactly like what he was, a 28-year-old kid who had spent too long pretending he didn't need anyone, sitting in a warm house eating soup made by an old woman who had seen right through him without even trying. The deputy arrived about an hour later. Young guy, maybe 25, nervous in the way that young law enforcement gets when they've been told something that didn't turn out to match what they found. He stood in the doorway, took in the scene, took in the 30 bikers who were, by then, helping Eleanor rearrange her furniture to fit more people comfortably, who were washing dishes and stoking the fire, and in one case that still makes me smile, helping her sort a box of old photographs she'd been meaning to organize for years. And he stood there with his hand nowhere near his service weapon, which was exactly right, because there was absolutely nothing here that required a service weapon. He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, "are you okay?" "Perfectly fine, thank you, Deputy," she said. Carl meant well. He usually does. The deputy nodded slowly. His eyes moved around the room again. He was recalibrating in real time, visibly. Whatever mental picture he'd built on the drive over was not the room he was standing in. "You need anything? Any assistance?" "I need the storm to stop," Eleanor said pleasantly, "but I understand that's outside your jurisdiction." One of the guys, I think it was Hector Williams, who was one of our quieter members and had a dry wit that only emerged in specific circumstances, said from somewhere behind me, "We tried, Deputy. Storm didn't listen." A few guys laughed. The deputy, to his considerable credit, smiled. He left after a few minutes, satisfied that there was no emergency and nothing requiring intervention. He was a good kid. I hope he went on to be a good cop. But it was what happened after he left that I think about most. After the door closed and the sound of his patrol car faded into the storm, there was a moment of something in that room, a kind of collective exhale, a settling, a recognition. The outside world had looked in at us and had seen what it expected to see and had come prepared to deal with it. Eleanor had stood between us and that expectation and had simply, calmly, refused to confirm it. She had told Carl Briggs that we were guests in her house, not intruders. Not a problem to be managed. Guest. That word did something to the room. I felt it. I watched it move through the men around me like heat, like the warmth from that wood stove spreading from the center outward. Something in our collective posture changed. Something in how we held ourselves. We were guests. In her house, under her roof, by her choice. Danny Hargrove, who was not a sentimental man, who I had never seen show vulnerability of any kind in 15 years of riding together, sat down at Eleanor's kitchen table that evening with a cup of coffee and was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me across the table and he said so quietly that only I could hear it, "When's the last time somebody looked at us and just saw people?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew. The blizzard lasted through the night. By 8 o'clock that evening, it was clear we weren't going anywhere until morning at the earliest. The temperature outside had dropped to -18. The wind was still ripping down from the north, and Route 2 was completely buried under drifts that the state plows wouldn't touch until the storm broke. We were 30 men in a farmhouse that had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen, and we were going to be there until morning. Eleanor took all of this in with characteristic practicality. She found every blanket and quilt in the house, and there were many, because she was a woman who had grown up in Montana and understood the importance of quilts. And she distributed them without ceremony. She pointed out the bathroom with instructions about water conservation because the pipes would be working hard in this cold. She made a second, larger batch of soup for dinner. She found half a bottle of decent bourbon in a cabinet above the refrigerator, and looking around the room at 30 bikers who were trying to be on their best behavior, made what I'm sure she recognized as an entirely reasonable executive decision and set it on the kitchen counter with a collection of mismatched glasses. 1 glass each, she said firmly. It's cold medicine. Several men who would have fought anyone else on earth over a ration of bourbon said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it. I'd been watching Eleanor all day, watching how she moved through the group, how she read people, how she seemed to know instinctively who needed what. The practical help, the soup, the coffee, the blankets, but also the other kind, the kind you can't put in a bowl. She'd given Stitch extra food because she'd seen he was hungry in a way that went beyond the day's ride. She'd sat with Pete and let him talk about his wife, who had left him 2 years earlier, while they washed dishes. She had asked Danny questions about leadership and logistics in a way that was clearly genuine. She wanted to know, was interested, and Danny had answered her with a directness and thoughtfulness that I'd rarely seen him show with anyone outside the club. She was, I was coming to understand, one of those people who make the world feel more inhabitable just by being in it, not because they're naive or sentimental or protected from hard realities. Eleanor Grace Whitfield was none of those things, had lived a full life with its full share of grief and difficulty, but because they've arrived at a place of such settled certainty about the fundamental decency of human beings, that their belief in it becomes, around them, self-fulfilling. I found myself at one point late in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Eleanor made a final round of coffee, and I said something that had been forming in me all day. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, "you weren't afraid of us when you opened that door." She looked at me over the top of the percolator. "No," she said. "Why?" She considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. "My husband George," she said, "used to say that fear is just the distance between what you know and what you think you know." She poured the coffee. "I could see 30 men in my driveway in a blizzard. I didn't know your names. I didn't know your stories. I knew you were cold." She set a mug in front of me. That seemed like enough to go on. I sat with that for a while. "A lot of people would disagree," I said. "A lot of people let what they think they know get in the way of what's actually in front of them," she said, and there was no judgment in it, just observation, clear and plain. "That's not wisdom, that's just habit." She sat down across from me with her own coffee, and for a while we were quiet. From the living room came the low sound of men talking, the occasional burst of laughter, the creak of the floorboards as someone shifted position. The wood stove was working steadily, and the sound of the wind outside made the warmth inside feel more substantial, more earned. "Your grandson," I said. I'd seen the photograph on the mantel, the young man with her eyes and George's height. "Tommy?" She smiled. "He's in Missoula University." She was quiet for a moment. "He worries about me out here alone. Calls every Sunday without fail." She looked at her coffee mug. "He's a good boy. Thinks I need looking after." "Do you?" She looked up at me with those clear brown eyes. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I've been looking after myself longer than you've been alive." I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was around 10 o'clock at night, the storm still raging, most of the men asleep or close to it in various positions around the living room floor, when the situation developed that I didn't learn the full story of until much later. Carl Briggs had not been satisfied. He'd gone home from his check on Eleanor. He'd watched through his window. He'd seen the deputy's patrol car come and go, and he'd decided, in the way that men decide things when their anxiety is greater than their information, that something was still wrong. He'd made more calls to the county sheriff's main office, to his cousin who was a state trooper, to 2 neighbors further down the county road. He'd painted a picture in those calls of a vulnerable elderly woman being held in her own home by a gang of dangerous bikers. And he'd used that word, held, which was not a description of anything that was actually occurring, but which had the benefit of galvanizing people. We were asleep when the second knock came, around midnight, louder this time, more official. Danny was up before most of us, his instincts the way a long-time leader's instincts are, tuned to disruption even in sleep. He was at the door before Eleanor, who appeared from her bedroom in a housecoat, her white hair pinned back, looking more annoyed than alarmed. There were 3 of them, a county sheriff's deputy, a state trooper, and Carl Briggs himself, standing just behind them in the way that the person who called something in always stands, slightly back, invested in the outcome, trying to read the room from a safe distance. The trooper was older, experienced, with the look of a man who had been in law enforcement long enough to have seen the difference between what a call says and what a call is. He took in the scene with the same recalibrating expression the first deputy had used. Danny at the door, the sleeping forms of men visible behind him, Eleanor coming down the hallway in her housecoat, and I could see him adjusting. "Ma'am," he said, looking past Danny to Eleanor, I need to hear from you directly. Are you here by your choice? Is everything all right?" Eleanor tied the sash of her housecoat and walked to the door and stood beside Danny. And she looked at the trooper and then at Carl Briggs behind him, and she said, "Raymond Carl Briggs, you woke me from a dead sleep at midnight." Carl Briggs had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Eleanor, I was worried. I know you were worried," she said, and her voice in that moment was the clearest, most direct thing I'd heard all day. "And I know it came from a good place, and we will talk about it. But right now, I need you to hear me clearly. I am in my own home, by my own choice, with guests that I invited in out of a blizzard. And the only thing wrong in this house is that it's now midnight and people are being woken up unnecessarily." The trooper looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Danny. Then he looked at Carl Briggs. "Sir," he said to Carl, "I think we're done here." Carl Briggs looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and something moved across his face that was more complicated than I could read from where I was standing. Doubt, maybe, or the beginning of it, the first crack in a wall that had been built over a lifetime of assumptions. "You're sure?" he said to Eleanor. "Raymond," she said, and her voice was gentle now, genuinely gentle. No iron in it, just warmth and patience. "I'm sure. Go home, get warm. I'll see you at church Sunday." He went. They all went. The door closed and the house settled back into its nighttime quiet. And Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the door. And then she looked at Danny. "I'm sorry about that," Danny said quietly. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said firmly. Then she looked past him at me and at the other men who had woken up and were watching from the living room. "Everyone go back to sleep," she said, in exactly the tone a grandmother uses. "We'll deal with the rest in the morning." We went back to sleep. I lay on the floor in the dark, listening to the wind and the breathing of the men around me, and I thought about Carl Briggs' face. Not with anger. I'd long since stopped being angry at people for being afraid of us, because fear is usually just ignorance, and ignorance is usually just distance, and distance can be closed. I thought about it with something more complicated, with recognition, because I understood Carl Briggs, not the specific version of him, not this particular man with this particular history, but the principle of him. The way a picture in your head can override the picture in front of your eyes, if the one in your head is vivid enough and old enough and has been confirmed by enough sources. The way we all carry those pictures and sometimes can't see past them. We had those pictures too, every one of us. Pictures we'd built over years of being on the outside, of being looked at and judged and dismissed and feared. Pictures that said, they will always see you as a threat. They will never see you as a person. Don't expect anything different. Those pictures had protected us, in their way, kept us from hoping for things we weren't going to get. Eleanor had just drawn a big X through all of them. In the morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and still and almost unbearably beautiful, the way Montana is after a big storm, when everything is covered and clean and the light comes off the snow with a quality that has no equivalent in any other environment on Earth. Clear blue sky, blinding white ground, the red barn standing out against it all like something painted. We started moving before dawn, quietly and carefully, trying not to wake Eleanor. But she was already up. Of course she was. She had coffee on and biscuits in the oven. Actual biscuits, made from scratch, because she was that kind of woman. And she was standing at her kitchen window when I came in, looking out at the white world. She turned when she heard me. "Sleep all right?" she asked. Better than I have in a while, I said honestly. She nodded, satisfied, and poured my coffee. We left Eleanor Grace Whitfield's house that morning the same way we had arrived. 30 bikes, 30 men, a column of iron and leather, but not the same, not even close to the same. I've been trying for 30 years to find the exact words for what was different. It's not easy, because what was different wasn't one thing. It was everything, in small ways. The way men held themselves, the way they looked at each other, a kind of quiet that was fundamentally different from the hard silence of the previous day. The storm had stripped something away from us, and Eleanor had put something else in its place, and we were riding back out into the world, carrying that new thing without quite knowing what to call it. Danny lingered on the porch with Eleanor while the rest of us got the bikes running. I watched them from near the gate, not close enough to hear the words, just seeing the shape of the conversation. Danny's big frame bent slightly toward her, his hat in his hands, something in his posture that I had never seen before, and would only see once or twice again in all the years after. Humility, maybe. Gratitude taken down to its bare bones, past the pride and the image and the habitual armor, to the place where it's just one human being saying to another, "You mattered. What you did mattered. I will not forget it." I watched Eleanor reach up and pat his arm. He covered her hand with his for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and came down the steps and got on his bike, and we rode. Nobody talked much that first hour. We just rode. Through the blinding white, the engines loud in the cold morning air. Route 2 ahead of us scraped clean by the overnight plow crews. I rode and I thought about what had happened, and I tried to hold on to all of it. The soup, the coffee, the quilts, the moment Stitch's face had broken open. The iron and warmth in Eleanor's voice when she'd stood in her own doorway and told Carl Briggs that we were her guests. I tried to hold on to all of it because I already knew, with the certainty you sometimes have about moments while you're still in them, that this was the kind of thing that would matter, that this was the kind of thing that would change the shape of what came after. We made Billings that afternoon. The rally was already going, bikes everywhere, the kind of organized chaos that a big Hells Angels regional event generates. People came up asking about the run, about the storm, about why we were a day late. Danny told the story, straight, no embellishment, just the facts. The blizzard, the side road, the farmhouse, the old woman with the soup and the quilts. He told it the way Danny always told things, with no editorializing, just the clean structure of events in sequence. The room got quiet when he told it. Not the uncomfortable quiet of men who don't know what to say, but the listening quiet of men who are paying close attention because they recognize that something real is being described. When he was done, someone said, "She knew who you were?" "She knew exactly who we were," Danny said. "And she fed you anyway. Fed us, housed us, covered us in quilts, and told the county sheriff to go home." Silence. Then, from someone near the back, "What's her address?" Laughter, but also something underneath the laughter that was serious. In the weeks after the rally, something began to happen that none of us had planned or organized. It started with Danny making a phone call to Eleanor, checking in, making sure she'd come through the storm without any property damage. The barn roof had taken some weight but held, and Tommy had driven out from Missoula the following weekend to check on her and had found his grandmother in excellent health and inexplicably amused by something she kept not quite telling him the full story of. Then Pete Calloway called her. Then I did. Then one by one, almost every man who had been in that house called to check in or wrote a letter, actual handwritten letters, because Eleanor didn't use email and wouldn't have wanted to, or sent something, food, supplies, firewood arranged and stacked by men who showed up without announcement and worked for an afternoon and left without asking for anything. She wrote back to everyone who wrote to her, every single letter, in her careful, slightly arthritic handwriting, on paper that smelled faintly of lavender. She asked follow-up questions about things we'd mentioned. She remembered details. When Stitch mentioned in his letter that he was thinking about getting his GED, he'd never finished high school, something he'd told her in a conversation I hadn't heard, but that he mentioned to me afterward. She wrote back a full page about the community college in Butte, the programs they offered. The name of an admissions counselor she'd heard was particularly helpful, and a sentence at the end that I know for a fact Stitch kept in his wallet for years. A man who wants to learn is a man who understands that he's worth more than where he started. He got his GED, took 2 years, and was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, he told me later. Went on to get an associate's degree in automotive technology, has his own shop now in Billings, does good work, built a good life. He has Eleanor's letter framed on the wall of his office. I've seen it. But the full weight of what had changed, the full dimension of what Eleanor had set in motion with one act of instinctive, unconditional hospitality, that didn't become clear to me until about 6 months after the blizzard. Tommy Whitfield called Danny Hargrove in August. I wasn't in on the call, but Danny told me about it afterward, sitting in the parking lot of our chapter's bar in Missoula on a summer evening, leaning against his bike with a beer in his hand and looking at the sky. Tommy had called to thank us, formally, carefully, as young men do when they rehearse something because it matters to them. He said that his grandmother had talked about that night every week since it happened, that she'd told him it was one of the best evenings of her life, not because it had been easy, but because it had been real, and because she'd had the chance to do something useful with it. He said that she had told him that those 30 men had reminded her that people are generally better than the story told about them, and that this was the most important thing she knew, and she'd been glad to have it confirmed. Then he'd said, she's been having some trouble with her property. There's been some vandalism. Someone spray painted her fence last month, and last week someone let her cattle out deliberately. She thinks it might be some young men from town who've been giving her trouble. She didn't want to worry anyone. I'm telling you because I didn't know who else to call. Danny was quiet for a moment when he told me this. Then he said, I know who to call. The calls went out the next day. Not angry, not threatening, just informational. There is a woman in Havre, Montana. Her name is Eleanor Grace Whitfield. She is our friend. If she needs anything at all, someone will be there. Within a week, there were 3 bikes parked near her property on a rotating basis. Riders doing nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just present, just visible, just making it clear that Eleanor Whitfield was not alone, and that anyone interested in causing her trouble was going to need to think carefully about what that meant. The vandalism stopped immediately, but it became something more than that, and this is what I couldn't have predicted. Word spread, in the way that it spreads in our world, through runs and rallies and calls and the constant movement of men who cover ground for a living. The story of Eleanor, the blizzard, the soup, the quilts, the way she'd stood in her doorway and told Carl Briggs to go home. That story spread, and something about it caught, Something about it resonated in a way that made men want to tell it and retell it, the way good stories do. By the following spring, there were chapters from 3 states who had heard the story and who considered themselves, in whatever informal way these things work, part of the network of people who had Eleanor's back. The number had grown from 30 to something closer to 200. By the end of that year, it was close to 300. By the time Tommy called Danny again to tell him that Eleanor's back porch needed replacing, and she was too stubborn to hire anyone, the response was 23 men showing up on a Saturday with lumber and tools and a cooler full of food and having that porch rebuilt by noon. Eleanor came outside and looked at the work and then looked at the 23 men standing in her yard covered in sawdust and said, "I hope you're all staying for lunch," in exactly the tone she'd used that first February night, and everyone did. I was there that day. I remember sitting on the new porch in the afternoon sun, watching Eleanor move between the men with iced tea, and the particular quality of attention she gave to everyone she talked to, and thinking about what it means to see someone, really see them, to look at a person and refuse to let the distance between your assumptions and their reality make you stupid or unkind. To look at 30 Hell's Angels in your driveway in a blizzard and see, simply, 30 people who are cold. Carl Briggs came to see Eleanor the Sunday after the porch was built. I know this because she wrote to me about it. He'd come after church with a pie his wife had baked, peach, because he knew it was Eleanor's favorite, and he'd sat at her kitchen table and drunk coffee and said eventually what he'd been trying to say since February, that he'd been wrong about what he thought he saw, and that he was sorry for the midnight knock, and that he wanted to understand better. Eleanor, by her own account, had not made it easy for him. Not because she was unkind, she was never unkind, but because she believed that understanding something correctly was worth the discomfort of getting there. And she wasn't going to shortcut the process just to spare his feelings. She'd told him, quietly and directly, what it had meant to us to be treated as guests rather than threats. She told him what she thought the difference was between being cautious and being prejudiced. She told him that she understood why he'd called the sheriff, and that she knew it came from care, and also that care dressed up in assumptions was just fear with better manners. Carl Briggs was apparently quiet for a long time after that. Then he said that he'd like to meet some of the men, properly, if the opportunity arose. It arose the following summer. Eleanor organized what she called, in her letters, simply a cookout, and what was in practice a gathering of about 40 riders and half the residents of the county road. And by all accounts, it was one of the stranger and more successful social events that stretch of Montana had seen in some time. Carl Briggs was there. He talked with Pete Calloway for 2 hours about engine maintenance, which was apparently a subject Carl knew something about, and they found enough common ground in carburetors and timing belts to build from. I'm told they shook hands at the end of the day with the genuine warmth of men who discovered they were wrong about each other. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I'm telling you all of this from the vantage point of 72 years and 46 years with the Angels. And I want to be honest with you about what I've learned, because I don't have patience anymore for anything less than honesty. The world has a story it tells about men like me. It's not an entirely wrong story, We gave it a lot of material to work with over the years, and I won't stand here and pretend otherwise. We were rough, and we were loud, and we didn't always make choices that held up well in the light of day. The patches on our cuts weren't just fashion statements. We knew what we were, and the world knew what we were. And there was a kind of cold clarity to that arrangement that had, at minimum, the virtue of honesty. But the story was never the whole story. That's what Eleanor understood. That's what she saw, standing in her doorway in her blue cardigan and her wool slippers, looking at 30 frozen bikers in her driveway. She saw that the story was not the whole story. She saw men, cold, scared men, though we'd have died before admitting the scared part. Men who needed what any human being needs when caught in a Montana blizzard: warmth, food, shelter, and the basic dignity of being treated like a person. She gave us all of it, without hesitation, without conditions, without the smallest flicker of the fear that the rest of the world would have felt in her position. And what happened in response? We became what she saw. That's the thing I want you to understand. That's the heart of this whole story. We didn't become better men because she helped us, though she did, and we were grateful. We became better men because she saw us as better men, because she looked at us and treated us as people worth caring for. And that treatment created an obligation in us that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with what it means to be seen. When someone sees you, really sees you, past the image and the reputation and the fear and the armor, you can't just go back to being only the thing the world told you that you were. You know better now. You've been shown something about yourself that you can't unsee. Eleanor showed us that we were people capable of being cared for. That made us responsible for living up to it. Tommy Whitfield graduated from the University of Montana 2 years after the blizzard with a degree in civil engineering. Danny Hargrove drove to Missoula with 5 other guys for the ceremony, and they sat in the bleachers in their cuts and cheered when his name was called. And Eleanor sat between them in her good blue dress and her pearls and wept happy tears that she would have denied were happy tears if anyone had called them that. I talked to Tommy once, years later, about what it had been like to grow up knowing that his grandmother was being watched over by 300 Hell's Angels who rotated in formal protective shifts on her property and answered her calls within hours. He laughed, a warm, easy laugh that told me he'd grown up knowing he could afford to laugh at it because it had never been a frightening thing, only an unusual one. She never thought it was strange, he said. She thought it was the obvious result of treating people like people. He was quiet for a moment. She used to say that all human relationships are basically the same transaction. You decide how much of the real thing you're willing to show, and other people decide whether to meet it. She was just always willing to show all of it, right from the start. He paused, and then he said something that I've carried with me since. She told me once that the best things she ever did in her life were the things she did for people she didn't know yet, because those were the ones where it had to come from somewhere real, not from love for a specific person, but from love as a general policy, as a way of being in the world. Love as a general policy, as a way of being in the world. I've thought about that phrase 10,000 times. I've turned it over in my hands like a stone, felt the weight of it, examined the edges. I've thought about how different my life would have been if I'd had that as a guiding principle from the beginning, instead of arriving at something like it in a farmhouse off Route 2 at age 40, handed to me by a woman who had figured it out decades before I showed up. But I'm not sorry it came when it came. I'm not sorry it came the way it came. There's something about the hardness of the path to a realization that makes the realization stick. Men who've been hard their whole lives don't change easily, and they don't change lightly, and they don't change for small reasons. Eleanor gave us a reason that was bigger than small. She gave us herself, without reservation, on a February night when the temperature was 20 below and 30 bikers were in her driveway, and every reasonable instinct in the world would have told her to lock the door. She opened it instead. Eleanor Grace Whitfield died in March of 2009. She was 96 years old, and she died in her own home, in her own bed, with Tommy beside her, and the wood stove going in the living room, and the pale early spring light coming through the curtains. Tommy called Danny Hargrove the morning of her funeral. He called me too. He called 15 other men who had been in that farmhouse 18 years earlier, or who had come into the orbit of Eleanor's particular gravity in the years since. He called because he knew we'd want to know, and he was right. And he called because he knew we'd want to come, and he was right about that too. There were 240 bikes in the procession to the cemetery on the edge of Havre that morning. I know that number because I counted them, standing near the back of the column, my hand on my engine, watching the line of machines stretch back further than I could see. 240 bikes from chapters across 5 states, riders who had heard the story at rallies and runs and had driven hours through March cold to be there. The sound of us moving through Havre that morning, the deep rolling thunder of 240 engines, was the loudest sound the town had heard in years. The people of Havre lined the streets to watch. I'd been expecting something else, honestly. Some of the old wariness, the crossed arms, the sideways looks. Instead I saw, and I still feel this in my chest when I remember it, I saw people standing on the sidewalk taking off their hats. I saw a woman reach out and put her hand on the arm of the man next to her and say something. I saw Carl Briggs standing in front of his hardware store, and our eyes met as I passed. And he nodded, and I nodded back. And there was something in that exchange that had taken 18 years to arrive, but was no less real for the time it had taken. At the graveside, Danny Hargrove spoke. He was not a man who spoke publicly, ever. It went against every instinct he had. But he stood up and took off his hat and said what needed to be said, in the way he said everything, straight and simple and completely true. Eleanor Whitfield looked at 30 men the world had written off and saw something worth caring for, he said. She was right, and the least we can do for the rest of our lives is try to deserve it. That was it, 27 words. I've heard eulogies that lasted 30 minutes and said less. After the graveside service, Tommy came to stand with us. He was in his late 30s by then, solid and quiet like his grandfather must have been, with his grandmother's eyes. He shook hands with Danny and with Pete and with Stitch and with me, and when he got to Stitch, he paused for a moment, and Stitch put out his hand, and Tommy took it with both of his, and they stood there for a second without words, and neither of them needed any. On the way out of the cemetery, I stopped by Eleanor's grave one last time, just to be there one more moment. The stone was simple, her name, her dates, and a line below that Tommy had chosen. I crouched down to read it. She saw people clearly and loved them completely. There was no distance between the two. I stayed there for a while. The wind was coming down from the north again, cold still, even in March, because Montana is Montana. And the 200-plus bikes were starting up behind me, the thunder of them rolling across the cemetery like something ancient and alive. I put my hand on the stone. It was cold and solid and real. "Thank you," I said. "We got there. Most of us anyway. Thanks to you." I got up. I walked back to my bike. I put on my helmet and my gloves, and I kicked the engine over, and I fell into the column, and we rode. That's the thing about a good road, and a good life, and the good people who appear in both without warning and change everything. You don't always understand what they gave you until you're carrying it for years, until it becomes part of the load you travel with, part of the weight that's not burden but ballast, the thing that keeps you upright when the road gets rough, when the storms come in fast, when the temperature drops and the visibility fails, and you can't see the road markings anymore. Eleanor Grace Whitfield was our ballast. She became to 300 men who scared the rest of the world the still point around which a different understanding of who we could be was organized. She did it with soup and coffee and quilts, and a door that she opened when every reasonable instinct said, "Keep it closed." I'm 72 years old. My knees ache in the cold. I've got 46 years of road behind me and more stories in my chest than I'll ever tell. But this one I keep telling every time I get the chance, to anyone who'll sit still long enough to hear it. Because some things deserve to be remembered. Because some doors deserve to be kept open. Because somewhere out there, right now, there's a person who thinks they already know what they're looking at, and all they need is someone to show them differently. Eleanor would have opened the door. I try to do the same. Guys, I want to end this video by saying something from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for being here with me. I mean it. Every view, every like, every comment, all of this means so much more than you can imagine. I know your time is precious. And the fact that you choose to spend a few minutes here, watching what I create, motivates me to keep giving my best every day. If this video touched you in any way, let me know here in the comments. I read everything. And often it's your words that give me the strength and inspiration for the next video. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and become part of this community that's growing with so much love. And if you can, share this video with someone who also needs to hear this message. I am immensely grateful for each and every one of you. See you in the next video.